The long, solitary drive back to Madison on New Year's Eve was framed by a bitter Wisconsin twilight, the heavy winter sky hanging low like a dark velvet cloak over snow-dusted pine trees. I had spent the entire afternoon clearing out my preschool classroom, tucking away colorful finger paints, wooden building blocks, and picture books, while warmly looking forward to the quiet comfort of a traditional family holiday. But when I turned my sedan into our long, ice-crusted gravel driveway at 7 in the evening, my headlights illuminated a dark, entirely lifeless facade. The porch light was off, the heavy oak windows stared back like empty sockets, and no familiar curl of cedar wood smoke rose from the brick chimney into the freezing night air. Stepping across the threshold into the dark entryway, I was instantly struck by a wall of stagnant, bone-chilling cold that felt entirely unnatural for a late December evening. The central heating thermostat hung completely dark on the hallway wall, powered down as if the entire house had been deliberately abandoned to the encroaching frost. In my 6 years of teaching young children, I had developed an acute sensitivity to the silent frequencies of a room, the quiet shifts in atmosphere that precede an unexpected spill or an unspoken tear. As I stood in that freezing foyer, surrounded by an ominous, suffocating silence, my chest tightened with a sudden, visceral alarm that made my pulse race wildly against the cold, whispering that my peaceful home had become the staging ground for a devastating catastrophe. Every instinct honed in my quiet classroom urged me forward into the gathering shadows. Dropping my heavy overnight bag onto the bare hardwood floor, I sprinted down the carpeted hallway toward the master bedroom, propelled by an inexplicable, overwhelming instinct. When I pushed the heavy wooden door open, my breath hitched sharply in my throat at the terrifying scene before me. My father, Marcus, was lying crumpled on the edge of the unmade mattress, his entire body curled inward like a dry leaf caught in a winter gale. His face was ash gray, drenched in a thick layer of cold sweat, and his knuckles turned translucent white as he clutched the left side of his chest, gasping desperately for thin slivers of oxygen. The air in the room was heavy with the silent agony of a massive, acute myocardial infarction. Panicked, I reached into my coat pocket for my mobile phone, but as I turned toward the bedside table, a bright neon yellow sticky note resting beside his alarm clock caught the ambient light. Written in my mother Diane's careless, slanting handwriting were 2 casual sentences that severed my heart in 2. Sabrina and I flew out to Maui for our winter getaway. Stay here and take care of your father. There were no emergency phone numbers, no medical notes, and not a single drop of human concern. Just a cold, administrative instruction, leaving a dying man alone to freeze in his own home while they boarded a flight to a sun-drenched island resort. The sheer, calculated callousness of those scribbled words hung in the frigid air like a poison cloud, marking an indelible betrayal that no future apology could ever erase. My hands shook violently as I unlocked my phone screen to dial 911, but before I could press the green call button, a trembling, ice-cold hand reached out from the mattress and locked firmly around my wrist. My father's grip was physically frail, Yet the emotional intensity behind his touch possessed an iron resolve that brought me to an immediate halt. Fighting through the crushing pressure in his chest, he forced his head to turn toward me, his bloodshot eyes burning with a searing, crystalline clarity I had not seen in his expression for 30 long years. The soft, endlessly accommodating man who had spent 3 decades bowing his head to appease my mother's extravagant demands seemed to dissolve right before my eyes. He looked directly into my face, his chest heaving with every ragged breath, and whispered in a low, gravelly voice that carried the heavy weight of a lifetime's worth of unspoken heartbreak. "Will you help me teach them a lesson, Chelsea?" A profound, unshakable wave of clarity washed over my soul, dissolving every trace of panic into an unyielding shield of protective devotion. Looking down at the gentle man who had quietly supported my life without ever asking for recognition or praise, I gave him a firm, solemn nod, squeezed his icy fingers tightly in mine, and pressed the call button to summon the emergency paramedics into our frozen house, knowing that the fragile illusions of our past had shattered into dust and that our quiet lives had officially changed forever. In that sacred moment, the daughter became the guardian. The steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor echoed through the sterile quiet of the intensive care unit at UW Health, measuring the fragile boundary between life and death. I sat in a rigid plastic chair beside the hospital bed, watching my father's chest rise and fall beneath thin flannel blankets as pure oxygen hissed softly through his nasal cannula. Dr. Aries, the attending cardiologist, walked quietly into the room, carrying a heavy medical clipboard, his stern features softening with a mixture of professional gravity and deep human empathy. He explained that my father had suffered a catastrophic, near-fatal myocardial infarction, stating plainly that if the emergency medical team had arrived even 5 minutes later, his heart would have permanently failed. When I followed Dr. Aris out into the bustling, fluorescent-lit corridor, he handed me the official hospital admission forms to complete our intake file. The document required a designated primary emergency contact and a legally recognized medical decision-maker for his ongoing care. I stared at the blank lines, acutely aware that the 2 individuals who legally held those titles were currently sipping tropical cocktails thousands of miles away on a Hawaiian beach without a care in the world. Without a single moment of hesitation, I pressed my pen firmly to the crisp paper, printing my own name and signing the legal documents as his sole emergency representative, permanently stepping into the silent void left by their ultimate betrayal, and claiming my role as his guardian. Standing in that brightly lit hallway, I felt an unshakable sense of purpose replace my grief. Several hours later, as the early morning sun cast pale golden rays across the polished hospital floorboards, my father's eyelids fluttered open against the harsh fluorescent lights. He groaned softly, his tired gaze wandering around the small room before finally resting upon my face. For a fleeting second, confusion clouded his features, but the horrific reality of the previous evening quickly swept back into his consciousness like a cold, crushing tide. He reached out slowly toward the bedside table, quietly pointing toward his personal belongings resting there. I handed him his phone, watching the warm glow of the screen illuminate his hollow cheeks. Right at the top of his social media feed was a fresh photo posted by my sister Sabrina. My mother and sister sitting on a sunlit patio at a luxury Maui resort, holding crystal glasses of champagne beside designer shopping bags, captioned, "Escaping the freezing winter to live the real island life." My father stared at the image in complete mathematical silence. The heart monitor beeped slightly faster, but he did not yell or weep. He simply powered down the device, set it face down on his chest, and stared up at the white ceiling tiles as 30 years of blind marital tolerance evaporated into cold, calculating resolve. Turning his head toward me, he whispered in a definitive voice that carried an unbreakable oath. "There is a metal safe hidden under the floorboards in my home office. Go get it, Chelsea, and tell no one. We are going to protect our future once and for all." Leaving the quiet, clinical hum of the hospital ward behind, I drove back through the freezing Wisconsin night toward our dark, vacant home on Madison's quiet outskirts. The winter wind howled bitterly against my sedan's windshield, tossing dry snow across the asphalt. But inside my chest, a fierce, protective fire had completely replaced my earlier helplessness. Arriving at the dark property, I unlocked the front door and walked directly into my father's private home office, closing the heavy oak door firmly behind me to shut out the haunting silence of the hallway. Kneeling beneath his massive wooden desk, I pressed my cold hands against the chilly hardwood floorboards, searching with my fingertips for the uneven seam my father had described. My fingers caught the faint, raised edge of the third oak plank from the left, which yielded slightly under firm pressure. Wedging a heavy flathead screwdriver into the narrow gap, I applied steady, downward force until the weathered wood popped open with a sharp, echoing crack. Resting inside the dusty, shallow cavity beneath the floor was a small gray metal fireproof safe, surprisingly heavy and cool to my trembling touch. I lifted the steel box by its sturdy handle, holding it against my chest like a sacred secret, and stepped back out into the freezing night air. Driving back through the snow-dusted streets, I felt the sheer physical weight of the safe resting in my passenger seat, sensing that within its dented frame lay the key to dismantling 30 years of quiet tyranny and reclaiming our family's stolen peace. Returning to the warm, fluorescent glow of the hospital room, I carefully set the gray fireproof safe onto the rolling tray table and pushed it over my father's lap. My father, Marcus, sat supported by stiff white pillows, his tired eyes brightening with a steady, resolute clarity as his frail fingers slowly entered a 4-digit combination into the electronic keypad. The heavy mechanical latch released with a distinct metallic click, and the lid swung open to reveal thick manila folders stamped with official red seals, court stamps, and crisp notary signatures. He reached inside, pulling out the top folder with reverent care, and rested it softly on his flannel hospital blanket. Taking a deep, measured breath to steady his pulse, He looked up at me and began to speak of his late father, my grandfather, Theodore, a fiercely private, self-made man who had passed away quietly just a few months prior. My father explained that grandfather Theodore had spent his long life quietly building a vast portfolio of commercial real estate and corporate assets, yet he had possessed the brilliant foresight to shield his entire life's work within a private, family-controlled trust. Because the trust was established long before Theodore's passing, the entire estate remained completely insulated from public court probate records and nosy relatives. My father tapped the thick folder gently, explaining that he had kept the inheritance completely quiet to observe whether his family's devotion was genuine before making any permanent financial commitments. And last night provided the definitive, heartbreaking answer that permanently shattered his illusions. Opening the thick manila folder, my father handed me a crisp, printed summary sheet, and as my eyes scanned the financial figures listed across the parchment, my breath caught sharply in my throat. The total value of the inherited estate was a staggering $24 million in secure liquid assets, corporate holdings, and the original deed to an expansive private waterfront villa situated on the pristine shores of Lake Mendota. Seeing my utter shock, my father spoke with absolute legal precision, explaining that under Wisconsin state marital property laws, inherited wealth held within a private, pre-existing family trust is classified strictly as separate property. Because these assets had never been deposited into or commingled with his joint marital bank accounts, my mother, Diane, possessed absolutely zero legal claim to a single dollar of the inheritance. The realization washed over me like a cleansing wave. 30 years of my mother's arrogant financial manipulation were rendered instantly powerless against the ironclad terms of my grandfather's foresight. My father reached for his leather wallet resting on the nightstand, pulling out a faded, worn photograph of our family taken over a decade ago. He stared intently at the image, tracing my mother's and sister's faces with his thumb, reflecting upon how their insatiable demands had systematically drained his spirit, energy, and bank account, while I had quietly worked to pay off my own student loans on a modest preschool teacher's salary without ever complaining, expecting praise, or asking for a single handout from anyone in this family. Tears of profound remorse welled in my father's tired eyes as he looked up from the photograph, locking his gaze with mine, while the heart monitor hummed a steady, peaceful cadence in the background. I spent 30 years giving them everything I had, Chelsea, he whispered, his voice cracking with genuine, soul-cleansing sorrow. I convinced myself that their endless demands were just normal family dynamics. But the moment I collapsed on that bed, they left me alone in the freezing dark to die. He reached across the white hospital blanket, locking his fingers around my hand with a firm, protective strength that betrayed no hesitation or doubt. I failed you for so many years by being blind to their selfishness, but I am not going to let them take this legacy or ruin your future. You are the only person in this family who ever loved me for who I am, not for what I could buy. Looking down at our joined hands, I felt the heavy, invisible chains of my past dissolve entirely, replaced by an overwhelming sense of warmth, healing, and mutual respect. My father was no longer a defeated victim submitting to emotional exploitation. He had stepped boldly into his role as a loving patriarch, determined to stand as an impenetrable shield between his youngest daughter and the toxic greed that had threatened to destroy our home. In that quiet room, his genuine repentance restored my faith in unconditional family love, offering us both a sacred second chance at true inner peace and emotional freedom. Realizing the profound power now resting in his hands, my father looked at the legal documents on his lap and then met my eyes with an urgent, unshakable focus. If your mother and Sabrina return from Maui and discover this inheritance before we secure it, he stated with quiet authority, they will use every weapon in their emotional playbook to manipulate, threaten, and drain these resources. I nodded in complete agreement, matching his serious tone as the strategic reality settled over our minds. "We need to move quickly, Dad," I replied, stepping toward the bedside table to grab his mobile phone. "We should call your estate attorney right now and execute every protective measure before their flight back from Hawaii even touches down on the airport tarmac." My father smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes for the first time in decades, and instructed me to dial the private number for attorney Robert Vance, a veteran estate lawyer who had managed grandfather Theodore's affairs for over 20 years. As the phone rang across the line, I looked out the hospital window at the pale morning light breaking over Madison, feeling an extraordinary sense of hope, strength, and divine timing. We were no longer passively waiting for cruelty to strike us. We were actively constructing an impenetrable fortress of truth and legal protection that would ensure our sanctuary, protect my grandfather's legacy, and permanently rewrite the trajectory of our lives as we stepped boldly forward into a bright, unburdened new chapter together. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, the heavy wooden door of the hospital room swung open, and attorney Robert Vance walked in carrying a dark leather briefcase, accompanied by a certified notary public and an independent witness. Before any legal documents could be unfolded, Dr. Aries stepped into the room to perform a mandatory medical capacity assessment, fulfilling strict legal protocols to ensure my father was in a fully sound state of mind before making life-altering decisions. Standing beside the hospital bed with a clinical clipboard, Dr. Aris asked a series of direct, precise questions regarding my father's full legal name, the current date, our exact location, and the specific nature of the legal meeting. Marcus answered every single question, clearly, confidently, and without a moment of hesitation, looking the physician straight in the eye as he explained that he was finalizing his estate planning to protect his separate assets. Dr. Aris made detailed notations in the permanent medical chart, officially recording that my father was completely lucid, mentally competent, and fully capable of executing binding legal documents. Watching my father speak with such unshakable composure, I felt a deep, healing warmth spread through my chest. The frail, defeated man who had spent decades in the shadows of emotional domination had vanished, replaced by an empowered patriarch claiming his voice. The doctor offered a warm nod of respect, signed the medical release form, and quietly exited the room, leaving the legal team ready to proceed with absolute professional confidence, knowing that justice was finally set in motion for us. Attorney Vance unclasped his briefcase, pulled out a stack of neatly organized legal binders, and pushed the primary document across the rolling tray table toward my father. He explained in clear, unvarnished terms that my father was executing an irrevocable trust, a permanent legal entity that would instantly receive the entirety of his inherited wealth. By signing these papers, the $24 million in liquid assets and the official deed to the Lake Mendota waterfront villa would move permanently out of my father's personal ownership and into the trust's absolute protection. Attorney Vance pointed directly to page 3, emphasizing that the document explicitly named me, Chelsea, as the sole trustee and exclusive legal beneficiary of the entire estate, ensuring that once signed, the transfer could never be altered, reversed, or legally challenged by his wife or anyone else in court. My father did not hesitate for a single second. Gripping the pen firmly, he signed his full legal name across multiple signature pages, with a steady, graceful hand that reflected his profound inner peace. The notary public reviewed his government identification and pressed her official ink stamp onto the signature lines, followed by the independent witness's endorsement. In less than 20 minutes, a lifetime of vulnerability transformed into an ironclad fortress, forever shielding our future from toxic entitlement and securing my grandfather's legacy in hands that truly cherished it. This pivotal moment was not merely about wealth. It was the sacred restoration of dignity, truth, and honor for our family, marking the official beginning of our quiet triumph. With the trust agreement legally cemented, my father reached for his mobile phone and dialed the customer service desk of his primary bank, placing the call on speakerphone so I could listen to every single word of the conversation. Speaking with quiet, surgical authority, Marcus instructed the bank representative to instantly revoke my mother Diane's status as an authorized user on all of his credit accounts, cutting off her ability to charge another dollar in his name. He then ordered an immediate freeze on all open personal credit lines, ensuring no new balances could be generated, before initiating a swift wire transfer of his individual retirement funds into a newly established, highly secure account accessible only by him. As the bank representative confirmed each completed transaction, I watched 30 years of financial entanglement dissolve into clean, unassailable boundaries that no manipulative argument could ever breach. There was no anger in my father's voice, nor any trace of petty vengeance. His tone carried only the calm, grounded dignity of a man who had finally chosen to stop financing his own emotional erasure. Standing beside his hospital bed, holding his hand tightly as the representative finalized the protective orders, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and relief wash over my soul. The invisible chains that had bound our home for decades were snapping one by one, replaced by the quiet, unyielding strength of self-respect. We were no longer helpless victims of exploitation, but proud guardians of our own peace, freedom, dignity, and unwritten future, ready to step into a new life together. When the representative asked if he also wished to close the primary joint checking and credit accounts, Attorney Vance offered a subtle, strategic nod, and my father delivered a cold, calculated instruction to leave those specific joint lines completely open and active. Attorney Vance explained the brilliant legal strategy behind this move. Under Wisconsin marital property law, leaving those joint accounts active while cutting off my father's financial deposits meant that every luxury resort charge, champagne tab, and shopping spree my mother and sister were currently generating in Maui would be documented as deliberate marital waste. Because my mother was actively swiping those joint cards with full knowledge that she was abusing marital resources, the rapidly accumulating debt would fall squarely upon her shoulders during the upcoming divorce proceedings. My father understood that by stepping back and allowing her greed to run its natural course without his financial subsidies, her own excessive actions would create the undeniable evidence needed to dismantle her financial claims in court. The bank representative confirmed that the joint account parameters were set exactly as requested, marking the complete lockdown of his personal assets. Setting the phone down on his lap, my father looked at me with a soft, knowing smile, realizing that the trap they were walking into was entirely constructed by their own unbridled indulgence, proving that poetic justice always finds its way back to those who betray love, truth, and family loyalty without remorse or empathy. They would learn that every choice carries consequences, and no amount of charm could shield them from reality. By the weekend, the hospital officially discharged my father, and on Friday afternoon, I drove him back to our quiet house in Madison, where a medical supply company had already delivered a temporary wheelchair and recovery essentials. As I helped him settle into the warm living room, an extraordinary sense of calm enveloped our home, replacing the cold, suffocating tension that had lingered there on New Year's Eve. We spent Friday evening and Saturday morning in peaceful, deliberate silence, organizing his vital personal documents, packing a few small boxes of his prized belongings, and preparing for the inevitable arrival of my mother and sister. We knew that our return to this house was only temporary, a quiet staging ground where we would deliver the final truth before leaving the past behind forever. My father sat comfortably by the window, watching the soft winter sunlight reflect off the snow, his physical strength returning day by day alongside his restored sense of purpose. There was no anxiety in our hearts, only the profound, steady confidence of two people who had stood together in the darkest night and found their way into the light. We were fully prepared for the storm that would land on our driveway late Saturday evening, knowing that our sanctuary was already built on an unbroken foundation of truth, loyalty, and love. Nothing could ever tear down the profound peace we had forged together in the shadow of trial, suffering, resilience, hope, and quiet redemption. We took a deep breath, embraced the quiet strength of our bond, and stepped into the future without fear. The quiet sanctuary of our Saturday evening was shattered late at night when a yellow taxi dispatched from Dane County Regional Airport pulled abruptly into our snow-dusted driveway, its heavy tires crunching over the ice. The rear doors swung open, instantly filling the freezing winter air with the loud, familiar voices of my mother, Diane, and my sister, Sabrina. They did not travel light. The driver spent several tedious minutes unloading 3 massive hard-shell suitcases, followed by an excessive mountain of branded shopping bags from luxury Maui boutiques. I watched through the frosted glass of the front window as they stood on the icy driveway, complaining bitterly about trunk space and the sudden temperature drop, treating the Wisconsin winter like a personal insult after their tropical getaway. Dragging their heavy luggage up the wooden front steps, they pushed open the front door, instantly overwhelming the dark entryway with the cloying scent of coconut lotion and expensive leather. Diane dropped 2 large shopping bags onto the rug with a dramatic sigh of exhaustion, kicking off her designer sandals while loudly bemoaning how stiff her legs felt after the long flight from Hawaii. Sabrina rolled her oversized suitcase directly into the center of the hallway, tossing her sunglasses onto the console table without offering a greeting. Neither of them called out to check on my father, nor did they ask how his emergency hospital visit went or if he was even still alive. Their complete, chilling indifference was a brutal, heartbreaking testament to their selfish priorities, proving how deeply hollow their idea of family truly was. Sabrina finally noticed me standing at the edge of the hallway, but she did not offer a warm greeting or ask about our father's health. Instead, her sharp gaze swept across the living room, taking in the small stack of medical paperwork, a folded blanket on the sofa, and a box of prescription medications resting on the side table. Her face twisted into a look of sheer, unadulterated disgust as she placed her hands on her hips. "Is this really how the house looks?" she demanded, gesturing vaguely toward the living room, while entirely ignoring the obvious medical nature of the items scattered across the furniture. "What an absolute mess! You were supposed to stay here and take care of Dad, not turn our living room into a complete dump. How are we supposed to relax after a long flight in this depressing environment? You are completely ruining our post-vacation vibe with all this clutter." I did not move or speak, maintaining a cold, unyielding silence as I crossed my arms against my chest. Sabrina stepped forward, her voice rising in a sharp, commanding tone. "Don't just stand there staring. Grab these luxury boutique bags and carry my suitcase up to my bedroom immediately. Be careful with the white bags because there are fragile perfume bottles inside. And make sure to clear off that coffee table right now so I can stretch out and sort through my shopping receipts." Diane stepped up beside her, unbuttoning her coat and echoing her daughter's arrogant entitlement without a second thought. Before my mother could unleash her usual harsh lecture on obedience and respect, the distinct squeak of rubber wheels echoed from the darkened kitchen corridor, causing both women to freeze in place. My father rolled his temporary wheelchair out from the shadows and into the bright, warm light of the hallway, holding a solid wooden cane capped with a heavy brass tip in his right hand. He did not look frail, weak, or forgiving. His posture was completely upright, and his eyes burned with an iron intensity that commanded immediate, absolute silence. Raising the heavy cane, he struck the brass tip forcefully against the hardwood floor, producing a sharp, thunderous crack that reverberated through the entire house, instantly cutting off my mother's mid-sentence rant. "Sit down, all of you," my father commanded, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register, completely devoid of his former weakness or hesitation. Stunned by his commanding presence, Diane and Sabrina backed up slowly, their arrogant demeanor faltering as the heavy wooden door to the home office clicked open. Attorney Robert Vance stepped out into the living room, carrying his thick leather briefcase, walking directly past my mother and sister without offering any polite pleasantries, before taking a seat in the armchair opposite the sofa. Hesitantly, Diane and Sabrina sank onto the edge of the couch, their faces displaying a mixture of deep confusion and sudden, unspoken dread as they realized this was no ordinary family argument, but a formal legal confrontation for which they were woefully, hopelessly unprepared. Attorney Vance unclasped his heavy briefcase, pulled out 2 neatly stapled legal packets, and slid them calmly across the glass coffee table toward my mother and sister. "These are official legal documents for your personal records," Mr. Vance stated in a neutral, strictly professional tone, as Diane hesitantly picked up her packet, while Sabrina leaned over her shoulder to read. Mr. Vance allowed them a few seconds to process the heavy legal terminology before providing a concise verbal summary. He explained that my late grandfather, Theodore, had left an extraordinary, multi-million-dollar estate, including $24 million in liquid assets and the official deed to a waterfront villa on Lake Mendota, entirely to my father as separate inherited property. He then pointed directly to the key clause on page 3 of the trust document, explaining that my father had legally transferred every single dollar and asset into an irrevocable trust. Chelsea is the sole trustee and exclusive legal beneficiary of this entire estate, Mr. Vance concluded, with absolute clarity. The transfer is completely finalized, properly notarized, and legally binding under Wisconsin law, meaning those assets are entirely shielded from marital claims during any divorce proceedings. Diane dropped the papers onto the table as if they had burned her fingers, the color draining completely from her face as the staggering reality set in. Sabrina grabbed the packet with shaking hands, frantically flipping through the pages in a desperate search for a legal loophole, her earlier smugness completely shattered by the undeniable weight of absolute truth that stood before them now in black and white. Diane stared at my father, her hands trembling violently as desperate, unbridled fury replaced her initial shock. "You cannot do this to us!" she screamed, her voice rising in a panicked shriek as she pointed a shaking finger directly at his face. "We have been legally married for 30 years. Half of everything you own belongs to me by right. And I will hire the most aggressive litigation attorney in this state to sue you for every single penny until this trust is completely dismantled." Attorney Vance remained entirely unfazed by her emotional outburst, leaning forward slightly with a calm, authoritative expression. "You are welcome to consult any attorney you wish, Mrs. Miller," Mr. Vance replied smoothly. "However, under Wisconsin state law, inherited wealth placed directly into a private, separate trust is strictly non-marital property. Because these funds were never commingled with your joint marital accounts, the trust is completely exempt from divorce division. Any lawsuit you file will be summarily dismissed by a judge, leaving you only with massive legal fees." Sabrina slammed her packet down onto the table, flushing red with anger as she glared furiously at me. "This is absurd. We are your real family. You're giving $24 million to a preschool teacher who can barely pay her loans? Leaving us with nothing? My father did not raise his voice. He simply sat upright in his wheelchair, his expression colder than the winter air outside. Completely unmoved by their desperate rage, as he prepared to deliver his final, decisive blow to their arrogant expectations. Sabrina's voice shrilled with bitter, unrestrained resentment as she glared across the glass coffee table, entirely dropping her polished real estate agent facade. "This is completely insane!" she shouted, her fists clenched white at her sides as her eyes darted between the legal trust documents and my calm face. "You are turning your back on your actual family to hand $24 million and a lakefront mansion to her while leaving us with absolutely nothing?" My father did not engage in a screaming match, nor did he raise his voice or defend my career. Instead, he sat perfectly still in his temporary wheelchair, his gaze steady and untroubled by her anger. Reaching into the side pocket of his wheelchair, he pulled out a thick manila folder and tossed it forward onto the coffee table, where it landed heavily on top of the trust papers. Diane stared at the new folder, her hands shaking too violently to open it immediately, as she looked at Attorney Vance for an explanation. "I am not arguing with you," my father stated in a low, definitive tone that cut through the tension. "I am simply informing you of the reality you created. Read the cover sheet." Diane slowly pulled the folder closer, gasping as her eyes scanned the bold black print at the top. "These are official divorce papers," my father announced calmly. "They were filed and processed at the Dane County Circuit Court early Friday morning. Our marriage is officially over." Early Monday morning, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine echoed through the quiet street as a massive commercial moving truck reversed slowly into our ice-crusted driveway. The air was crisp and clear as 3 movers in gray uniforms lowered the hydraulic ramp with a sharp metallic clang. Before Diane or Sabrina could process what was happening, my father handed the lead mover an itemized inventory list of his personal belongings, medical equipment, and private documents. As the men went straight to work boxing up my father's clothes, framed military commendations, locked filing cabinets, and his motorized hospital bed, Diane rushed downstairs in her pajamas, screeching in a frantic panic. She physically attempted to block 2 movers carrying document boxes through the front door, shouting at the top of her lungs, "You have no right to touch anything in this house. We are still legally married. This is my home, and you cannot just strip this place bare." My father calmly wheeled his chair toward the foyer, holding a crisp white envelope bearing the official logo of her primary mortgage lender printed clearly in the upper left corner. He handed it to her with an unreadable expression. Diane snatched the envelope from his hand, ripping it open to reveal a formal legal document stamped in red ink. "You might want to read that before you start making claims about this property," my father advised softly, his voice completely unbothered by her dramatic scene, as he prepared to unveil the final financial truth that would crumble her entitlement once and for all. Diane's eyes widened in horror as she scanned the bold headline printed across the document, a formal notice of default issued by the bank. "I stopped making financial contributions to the home mortgage last month," my father stated flatly, his tone entirely devoid of guilt or malice. "You took out that massive, unauthorized second line of credit, that HELOC, against this house 2 years ago to fund your endless shopping sprees and luxury vacations. I am no longer subsidizing your debts, Diane. Because the mortgage and the secondary loan have gone completely unpaid, the bank has officially initiated the judicial foreclosure process, and there is no reversing it. Sabrina gasped loudly, snatching the thick paper from her mother's trembling fingers and reading the details of the severe delinquency. The harsh, unavoidable reality of losing their primary residence hit them both like a physical blow. "You planned this from the very start," Diane whispered, her voice cracking with terror as she stared at the foreclosure notice in utter disbelief. "You are leaving us with nothing. How am I supposed to pay for this house? How am I supposed to live?" My father offered no sympathy, locking the brakes on his wheelchair to signal that the discussion was closed. "You will have to figure that out yourself, just as Chelsea and I had to figure out how to survive while you were drinking champagne in Maui," he replied calmly. "You made your choices, and now you must live with the natural consequences of your own reckless greed and cruelty." Furious and entirely unwilling to accept defeat in front of the movers, Diane grabbed her heavy designer handbag and threw her travel coat over her shoulders. "I am not staying in this freezing, empty house to be insulted by you," she snapped, turning sharply toward the front entrance with her head held unnaturally high. "I am checking into the Marriott downtown immediately, and I will deal with my high-powered litigation lawyers from a luxury suite." She stormed out the front door, slamming the heavy oak panel behind her so hard that the frame rattled, leaving Sabrina standing frozen in the cold hallway, surrounded by empty walls and broken dreams. I helped my father safely down the wooden front steps and guided him into my waiting car parked by the curb. As the mover secured the last of his personal boxes and drove away, I turned the ignition key, feeling the warm heater air fill the cabin. My father looked at the house one last time through the passenger window, his expression peaceful, quiet, and completely unburdened. He did not look back with regret, and neither did I. As I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb, I looked at my phone mounted on the dashboard, where my banking app was open, actively monitoring the joint account alerts. We drove slowly down the quiet, sunlit suburban street, leaving the wreckage of 30 years of emotional manipulation firmly behind us in the rearview mirror, as we headed toward our new sanctuary at Lake Mendota. 20 minutes later, as we pulled into a quiet coffee shop parking lot near the lake, my phone emitted a sharp, rhythmic chime, signaling a real-time banking alert. I unlocked the screen and held it out so my father could see the notification popping up from the bank app. Diane had just arrived at the front desk of the downtown Marriott, fully expecting VIP treatment as she handed the clerk her primary gold credit card. The clerk had inserted the card into the security terminal, but instead of printing a room key receipt, the machine issued a harsh, negative beep as a bright red error message flashed across the POS screen. Transaction declined. The transaction log showed that she immediately attempted to swipe her secondary card, only for the banking system to process the request and return the exact same instant result. Transaction declined. Her authorized user access had been completely revoked, and the joint accounts were frozen due to the massive outstanding balances she had accumulated in Maui. She had zero access to cash, no available credit limit, and no financial safety net left to cushion her fall. The total financial collapse she had so carelessly created was now a concrete, unavoidable reality. My father looked at the screen, took a deep, peaceful breath, and quietly closed his eyes as a soft, unburdened smile touched his lips. The long night of betrayal was over, and as we drove toward our waterfront home, we stepped into a future blessed with absolute freedom, genuine dignity, and unshakable peace. Standing on the worn cedar porch with a lukewarm mug pressed between my trembling hands, a profound and unfamiliar stillness settled into my chest, which had known only turbulence for too long. For months, my mind had been a frantic house overrun by ghostly echoes, unspoken regrets, the sharp sting of old betrayals, and the suffocating weight of expectations never met. But in this crisp, silver-tinged air, those ancient ghosts seemed frail, stripped of their power by the gentle, uncaring persistence of the rising sun. There was a quiet dignity in the way the frost melted off the porch railing, submitting entirely to the warmth, without struggle, without plea. It became suddenly clear that healing was not an aggressive battle to be fought and won, nor was it a violent purging of memory. It was simply the slow, courageous willingness to stop holding one's breath against the passage of time. The world was continuing its endless, beautiful loop, regardless of internal brokenness, offering an unspoken invitation to return to the living. To look out over the misty valley was to realize that every winter, no matter how brutal or relentless, eventually surrendered its ice to the patient roots beneath. The heavy mantle of sorrow, worn like armor for so many seasons, finally felt light enough to slip off my shoulders, falling softly away into the damp grass below. Walking down the flagstone path toward the orchard, the rhythm of my boots on damp soil felt like a grounded hymn, heavy and reassuring. For years, the foolish narrative had persisted that grief was a structural flaw, an embarrassing fragility that needed to be hidden away from polite society. Yet, looking at the ancient apple trees with their gnarled, scar-pitted bark, the truth became far more tender. Those trees had weathered decades of blistering prairie winds, ice storms that snapped major limbs, and scorching summer droughts that threatened to dry their very marrow. Yet, here they stood, reaching toward the sky, bearing fruit from the exact sites of their historic fractures. Human wounds were no different. They were not proof of brokenness, but sacred milestones of survival, marking every place where love, vulnerability, or endurance had been demanded. To have loved deeply enough to be shattered by loss was not a tragic mistake. It was the ultimate proof of a life fully engaged, a heart that refused to turn into stone when struck by hardship. The ache that still lingered was not an enemy to be vanquished, but an old, weary companion, asking only to be acknowledged and held with gentle mercy. In forgiving myself for not knowing how to navigate the wilderness sooner, my internal landscape shifted. The past was no longer an insurmountable mountain blocking the horizon, but the rich, dark soil from which new, quiet understanding could blossom. The realization felt like crisp spring water quenching a deep thirst long forgotten in the endless heat of a summer afternoon. By noon, the quiet road leading into the small river town buzzed with the unhurried rhythms of everyday life, a tapestry woven from ordinary grace. Watching an elderly carpenter carefully measure a piece of white oak outside his workshop, his calloused hands moving with patient reverence, a profound connection to the human mosaic surged forth. For so long, isolation had felt like a necessary sanctuary, a self-imposed exile to protect a raw and fragile soul from further bruised contact. But standing on the sunlit sidewalk, listening to the chime of the bakery bell and the cheerful chatter of neighbors sharing news, the illusion of separateness evaporated. Every person passing by carried their own invisible burden, their own quiet griefs and their own private triumphs hidden behind polite smiles and tired eyes. To be human was not to walk alone through an unforgiving storm, but to share in the warmth of a collective campfire built against the dark. A simple exchange of smiles with a passing stranger felt less like a polite social custom and more like an unspoken covenant of solidarity. In that sacred moment, my heart expanded to make room for others once again, realizing that true healing did not occur in isolation, but in the brave returning to the human fold. Grace was not found in distant, miraculous revelations, but here, in the dust, in the steam rising from freshly baked bread, in the gentle nod of a neighbor, and in the shared, quiet miracle of simply being alive together on this vast, beautiful, spinning earth right now. Sitting later on the grassy riverbank, where the clear water carved its slow path through gray shale, a deep sense of release finally took root. Forgiveness, it turned out, was not an act of absolution granted to those who had inflicted harm, nor was it a denial of the genuine pain I experienced. Rather, forgiveness was a quiet act of self-preservation. The deliberate decision to drop the heavy, hot embers of bitterness before they burned away the palm of my own hand. As the river effortlessly swept fallen autumn leaves downstream without holding on to a single leaf, the wisdom of flow became undeniable. Life was under no obligation to be fair or gentle, but it was brimming with endless opportunities to transform suffering into profound empathy. The pain that had once felt like an anchor dragging at the dark bottom of the sea was transforming into a steady compass, guiding my actions toward greater kindness, deeper patience, and genuine understanding for the broken places in others. There was a radiant freedom in relinquishing the impossible demand for a better past. The past was fixed in amber, unyielding and unchangeable, but the present moment remained completely wide open, plastic and soft, with infinite promise. Every tear shed had slowly washed away a stubborn layer of illusion, leaving behind a vision clarified by grace, and anchored in truth. To accept the entire journey fully, its dangerous precipices alongside its peaceful, sunlit meadows, was to step boldly into an indestructible inner peace that no external storm could ever diminish or take away from my sovereign soul again. As twilight gathered across the valley, painting the western sky in bruised violet and soft copper, the air grew crisp with the promise of coming stars. Walking back up the hill toward the lit windows of home, every step felt light, deliberate, and whole. The journey ahead remained unwritten, filled with unpredictable turns and inevitable challenges. Yet fear had lost its razor edge. In its place grew a quiet, resilient hope. Not the fragile optimism of youth that expects smooth roads, but the battle-tested confidence of a heart that knows it can endure darkness and still find its way back to light. The scars remained, etched permanently into memory and body, but they were no longer painful blemishes. They were the golden joinery of kintsugi, rendering the vessel far more beautiful and precious than it had been before the break. Stepping across the threshold into the welcoming warmth of home, a deep exhale swept through my body and mind, releasing the final shadows of yesterday into the gathering night. To live truly was not to seek safety from life's turbulence, but to embrace the full, breathtaking spectrum of human experience with an open, courageous heart. Standing in the soft glow of the doorway, looking out at the vast, starry sky, the future no longer felt like a daunting threat, but a breathtaking landscape waiting to be explored. A gentle smile touched my lips, born from a peace that required no conditions, only the quiet, profound realization that the long storm had ended. The healing was complete, and a beautiful morning was already rising.